Okay. Good morning. Welcome to the Idaho Federation of Families Parent Webinar for January. And we thank you for joining us. It's like a super snowy Thursday morning here in Boise, Idaho. Roads were a little crazy, so we really appreciate our presenter, Janelle Staffer, coming to join us this morning. It was not an easy ride to get here. But this morning we are doing a presentation to parents on the topic of good enough parenting is great parenting, an introduction to attachment therapy. Janelle is joining us. She has a private practice in Nampa. She specializes in trauma and attachment. She's been working in the field for about 17 years, specializing in trauma and attachment since about 2006. She is a native of Idaho. She's a parent of 2 children, and she also has a yoga studio where she does a practice that kind of integrates yoga with some of her treatment. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Janelle. One other quick addition is that those that are interested and have questions, they can be added to the chat box on the YouTube station, and we will provide those to Janelle to answer at the end of the presentation. So with that, Janelle, thank you very much for joining us, and we're looking forward to what you have to say.
Thank you, Carol. I'm very excited to be here and to share this information. The good news is that good enough parenting is great parenting, and we're going to chat about that today. I'm a mom. I have 2 daughters, and ages 12 and 9. And I can't think of better news when raising kids than to hear that good enough parenting is great parenting. I want to just give a quick nod to why I chose that title. In attachment theory, which is a theory of that kind of goes around the circles in psychology, attachment is a theory that's been around for about 100 years that describes the very important relationships between people that starts in in conception, really. We're designed to be relational people, and attachment theory is one theory that kind of looks at that. In attachment theory, this word emerged called good enough that describes and defines what is necessary from a parent to help create secure attachment with their children, which then translates later into security all the way through adulthood. So I chose the word good enough because it's actually a word in this theory. Today, my hope is to kind of go through it a little bit, because you might be surprised to find out that the way we think we have to parent, or the messages we get from our culture, which tell us we need to be a perfect parent and get it right, actually aren't right. We just have to be good enough. The greatest news about that is that research shows, and we've been duplicating this research over and over, that we actually only have to be good enough 30% of the time. 30%. So I always joke and say that I'm nudging up on 29.9%, so we're doing all right. We'll talk more about that as we go along, but that's what good enough is about in this. And according to the research, according to the studies, good enough is actually great parenting. So we'll spend some time with that today. I know that for today we're kind of looking at a couple different, there's parents, I think, online on this webinar, and there's professionals. And so in this presentation, you're going to find lots of things that are applicable for parenting. All of it is applicable for parenting, and some of it will include some theory and some support for the professionals that are part of this. So I'll try to kind of, each time we move into something that's less parenting and more professional, I might tell you what's going on so you're prepared. The good news, according to attachment science and this idea of good enough parenting, is that perfect parenting is absolutely a thing of the past. We don't have to be perfect parents to create the security that kids need to be successful later in life. We don't have to have the perfect clothes. We don't have to choose the perfect schools. All the stuff that bombards us as parents actually is just details. To be good enough is okay, which moves us to this idea that actually good enough might be the new perfection. It's time for us in our culture to sort of move out of this idea of being a perfect parent to create these perfect kids that are well behaved and walk away from it and move into this good enough concept, which creates space for kids to develop and become secure adults. We'll spend some time talking about that. I want to tell you a little bit about the guy who came up with the word good enough. His name is Dr. Winnicott. He is what we might call the father of this theory called object relations theory, which is very closely connected with attachment theory. He developed this idea of the good enough mother, a theory that I think we need to keep alive and is very relevant for us as parents. This next thing I'm going to cover is very intellectual. So this is the theory behind it. This isn't a practical thing that parents might love. But for the professionals out there, this is where the theory came from. He described the theory of the good enough mother as a woman, and he used the words mother because at the time of that culture, that was the primary caregiver. We now translate it over and use it as good enough caregiver. But he said that the good enough mother starts off with an almost complete adaptation of an infant's needs, meaning the infant is totally dependent upon this caregiver. Her brain, our brain, is completely connected to the ability of the child's brains to be developed. And he said that as time goes along, the good enough mother slowly weans off gradually so that the child can eventually learn to deal and cope with life on his or her own. He called these things failures, meaning the caregiver's complete adaptation at first, but then eventually failing to completely do everything for the infant meant that the kid had to figure stuff out on its own eventually. We'll cover that a great deal in this, but that's the basis of what it's come from theoretically, the good enough caregiver. So with that basis, I want to tell you what we're going to do with this information today. We'll start by reviewing attachment theory, the whole basis of what we're talking about, with the specific purpose of understanding what it is to have a secure attachment. And then we'll move into the qualities of good enough caregiving. And then my hope is, and we need to kind of play around with this in this format, but my hope is that we can make this a little bit interactive. More than just me up here giving this theory, which is going to be important for a portion of this hour, I'd really like to hear from you guys. And so we've opened up the opportunity for you to comment in the, in the comments, or I think it's called a live stream. So at any time, you're welcome to do that, and I will have access to it. And I would really like to hear that. The best learning in this will come from our interactions. And I'd really like to create space at the end for questions and comments. My experience with this information is that it's so innate. It makes so much sense that when you start to hear it, you are definitely gonna have some questions as we go along. And that might not be true for everybody, but I hope that you can kind of hear what's my intentions of finding this in you today. So let's start with this idea of attachment. Neurologically speaking, we are born, our brains are socially connected and dependent upon the brains of other people. We know this is true because if an infant was born and was not in the proximity of another brain, we know that baby would die. I mean, we know that with certainty. Beyond that, what we know is that infants, when they're born, they are born with the complete capacity to organize their brains, but they can't organize them on their own. They're dependent on a mature nervous system, an adult brain, to organize their brain. And the way that happens is through this thing called attachment, the ability for one adult brain to connect to and bond to an immature brain that creates a bond and a connection, which actually we know now through neuroscience organizes the circuits and the pathways in the brain until eventually a child grows into security and can do all these things on his or her own, but only because of those interactions, those attachment transactions between themselves and a caregiver who is present and available. Attachment is that space where all of that comes to be, where all of that happens. It's defined by Ainsworth and Bowlby as a deep and enduring emotional bond that connects one person to another across time and space. So let me tell you what this looks like in the brain. There's actually a pathway, a neuronal pathway in the brain that represents attachment. And the experiences that children have with their caregivers in their early years, and really as it's transcribing all the way until adulthood, forms that attachment pathway, which serves many different functions, which we'll talk about today. But the one most important for right now is it creates the exact pathway from which every other relationship sort of ties into. So the attachment bond that is created with parents absolutely defines how they will interact in future relationships as they grow. Now, we know also that the brain is not concrete. It is static. It can change. And so changes, if there are wounds and attachment injuries that happen on that attachment pathway, it absolutely will impact future relationships, but we know that the brain can change and can be healed, so I like to include that too. But attachment is a super important concept. It's sort of like a theory of being, a theory of becoming, because attachment is that place where that happens. Attachment, neurologically and from an evolutionary perspective, is a primal human connection that's evolutionarily necessary for survival. The first part of attachment that happens is just proximity. It's got to be, a baby needs an adult near in order to survive, to be protected. But what it moves into after that's there, after everything's safe and the infant is safe from all the harm from the outside world, the next step of it is that once it has that place, a place where it knows it's safe, then the infant knows and the kid knows that it's free to explore. So attachment is not just for safety then, it's also necessary for exploring and growing. So what we notice, you've heard, there's infants who do not have this consistent protection and survival, and we call them failure to thrive babies. And what happens with them is that literally when they do not have a safe place, when they are not protected and that proximity space is not there for them, that their system will actually shut down growth, because in order to grow, there needs to be this safe base, this attachment, which tells them, go ahead, go explore. So it's kind of a reciprocal response, proximity first and then exploration. And then eventually when that's happened enough in a good enough way, which we're going to talk about today, the child will internalize this and it will become their self-regulation, their self-navigation systems, which we call a secure attachment. And that secure attachment then gets translated into their ability to explore the world, to learn and grow, and to engage in healthy responses to their environment throughout their lifespan. Kind of an important deal. So let's talk then why attachment then is important for parenting. And because it's everything. Attachment theory and parenting it's everything in parenting. One researcher of attachment said that soul development depends on attachment and bonding. Every brain and body is genetically wired to develop itself, but the soulful development of brain and body depends on each child receiving the care of completely bonded caregivers. So it's quite literally everything for a child. In attachment theory, we call the attachment relationship the holding space. So kids, they come into this world. Their brains are not 100% developed. They need the space to be able to explore and feel safe so that they can decide through their environment, who they're going to be and what they're going to be. The attachment relationship is that holding space. In fact, in the very first year of life, infants, they decide whether or not this world is safe or unsafe. And the way that they decide that is whether or not that holding space is safe or unsafe. It's their entire world. The attachment relationship becomes this contingent relationship between parents and caregivers where kids decide exactly how they're going to be. The next slide I'm going to talk about talks about exactly what is developed in the attachment relationship. And then I'm going to step away for a second from the slides and start sharing some stories. So attachment theory is important for parenting because, as I've mentioned, it forms the basis of all future relationships. Not only that, but that attachment relationship, the ability to feel secure in a relationship, and then to connect in a bonding way with someone begins the development of empathy. And we've studied the development of empathy in attachment relationships from birth all the way through adulthood. And we know that the transactions in early childhood, such as eye contact with a caregiver, the ability to turn around when a child is exploring in a new place and see a caregiver, that those things, they translate in a kid's ability to look at another person and see them as a separate person and to experience feelings with them in an empathic way. And this can only happen when the very specific things in attachment have been given to them through the course of their development. We know also that attachment becomes embedded as the kid's sense of self-worth. So when a child has found security in a relationship and can turn around and see their parent and get comfort when they're stressed, and when they see their parents' own satisfaction with them, that they are pleased with them as a person, that gets internalized inside of the kid as their own sense of self-worth. We also know that attachment relationship determines a child's ability to respond to stress, and we're going to talk about how that happens in a second. That also translate into kids' ability to regulate their own emotions. They make sense of their own life through it, and then in the end, they're able to make meaningful connections with others. So this whole idea of attachment is actually super important for parenting. It helps kids make sense of all of their experiences. So I'm going to step away and just kind of talk for a second about the story of attachment. So I've said, the story is kids are born with an immature brain, with everything inside their brain able to be organized. They've got it all in there. The structure of their brain is fully there and ready, although we know brain development continues after. And the story is they need a mature nervous system. They need someone to help them make sense of what is appropriate to keep, what is appropriate to learn, so that they can move forward in their development. And it's step by step. It's very developmental. One thing has to be checked off and completed in that attachment relationship, so the next one can be addressed. And I'm going to tell I think most people understand the whole idea of babies, that when babies are born, they don't know how to talk or communicate their needs. And so I'm just going to kind of talk through how attachment works with babies so that you can see the science and the mechanisms of attachment. So when babies are born, once they see that their parents are going to be there, their brains are then soothed. Their brain says, oh, there is a caregiver here to take care of me. However, something will happen. They might get hungry, for example, and they begin to cry. When a baby begins to cry, neurologically, their brain gets dysregulated. On their own, babies do not know how to regulate themselves. While they are born with the capacity to regulate, it is something that has to be learned and experienced in this attachment relationship if they are ever going to understand how to do it for themselves. And so when a baby cries, is hungry, and becomes dysregulated, the first thing that a good enough caregiver does is respond. So comes in and hears the cry and gives a response that soothes the baby's nervous system. So very instinctively, if we were in a room and a baby started crying right now, we might all move over there. One of us might grab the baby and we might start rocking. So, and we know actually from some studies that we might all kind of do the same things regardless of what culture we were born into. There are just some things that soothe babies. And what is happening when that happens is the baby's nervous system becomes soothed, and that moment, that cry for help becomes integrated. So the baby is no longer disintegrated. The process of that happening over and over again becomes embedded and laid down in the baby's brain as a self-soothing mechanism. So though a baby is born with the ability to learn how to self-soothe, they will not figure it out on their own unless these attachment transactions have demonstrated it in a good enough way over and over to do that. Once that's happened enough, then we see that maybe at age 5, a kid gets dysregulated in some way, and he or she may be able to go inside themselves and soothe themselves if it's something that is not more than what a 5-year-old could handle. So, for example, they might go outside and fall down, and instead of getting totally dysregulated, they might know to take a deep breath and then turn around and seek soothing from a caregiver, and that regulates them. It will then transcribe later at age 10 to their ability to interact with friendships and get their feelings hurt, but then soothe themselves. And then as life goes on, all the way into adulthood, they're able to respond to situations, but it's only because of what got laid down and embedded because of that soothing relationship with an attachment figure. Now, conversely, on the other side, if soothing were to come in that did not allow the opportunity for a child to experience some stress, so that he or she may learn how to mediate the stress response and eventually internalize it, they won't be able to self-soothe eventually. So what I'm saying is there's a balance between, in a good enough caregiving way, there's a balance between soothing for a child at the ages that are appropriate to do that, and then creating space to back away, as Winnicott said, provide failures, so that a child may learn within themselves the ability to do that. And this is a very fine line, but attachment theory is really clear about how we can kind of facilitate that, and one of the ways is to be a good enough caregiver, which is why we're here talking today. So that's sort of the beginning parts of attachment. The most important thing to know, one of the most important things to know about attachment, and one of the reasons we look at it, is that attachment is actually an innate thing. This kind of parenting is not a to-do list parenting strategy. It isn't one where you're going to say, here's what you do when a kid does this, this, and this. This is an innate process. We actually know that attachment is necessary for all mammals, and that even in lesser developed brain mammals, like, for example, elephants and zebras, that they are exhibiting attachment relationships that are very similar to ours. Ours just have a more advanced brain, so we've got some extra stuff to tend to, like empathy and some relational things. But for the basics of attachment are actually the same, and it's innate in us. The sad thing about our culture, the reason I like to have this discussion, is because this concept of needing to get it right as a parent and finding the right responses and needing to do it as well as the neighbor down the road whose kids their shirts are all tucked in and they have all the great Christmas cards and all this perfect parenting, is that when we move into this to-do list kind of parenting, we move away from the innate process. It is built into us to want to attach to our kids and to want to respond in a way that actually promotes security. And my fear is that some of the cultural teachings that we teach about parenting move us away from that, and we lose something really important, and our kids lose something really important when we do that. The relationship that is developed between a parent and a child is of utmost importance, and I can't emphasize this enough. In my practice as a clinician, I do a lot of work with people who've been through extreme stress, toxic stress, trauma, and when anybody comes in to see me that has gone through a traumatic event, who has a secure relationship with their caregiver, and we're going to define security here in just a minute. But when they come into me with a secure relationship, the healing process from that traumatic event is fairly simple, because the resources that they've gained by having a secure relationship with their parent, what it does inside their brain is so healthy and so rich for them in their healing process that it doesn't take very long to heal. Conversely, when somebody comes in that has some insecurity, didn't experience a secure relationship in their caregiving relationships, when they come in to heal trauma, it takes them significantly more time to heal, because the resources that others might have gotten from a secure relationship, they do not have, and their healing is significantly longer. And that isn't just reflective of just when people get hurt. This is sort of how people with insecure attachments navigate the world. Their response to stress is significantly impacted because of what was lost by not having a secure attachment. So good enough caregiving sort of gives us this new way of looking at it to facilitate security. And going back to the innate and primal, I want to read this statement from the next PowerPoint slide. Because attachment is innate, primal for most, a case can be given for this statement. Good enough parenting is truly just real and authentic parenting. Becoming a good parent is not about perfection. Instead, it calls upon the removal of all blocks which prohibit the authentic expression of relationship and connection and guidance with the child. It's not what our culture promotes, but I'm trying to make a case with you here today that it's possible that we can get rid of all the external expectations and really get to what we need by just getting to our innate parenting capabilities. And it might be possible that the to-do list parenting or the trying to get it right parenting might actually promote more insecurity. So let's talk a little bit more about what it means to have a secure relationship and an insecure relationship. So, as I mentioned, attachment theory kind of studies the relationship between parents and caregivers, and they have defined the qualities of those attachments as either secure or insecure. A securely attached child is likely, when faced with potentially alarming situations, to tackle them effectively or seek help in doing so. What we know from research, which I cite here in just a second, is that the capability of somebody to do just this thing. So note that nothing in here is written about them being an A student. Nothing is written about them being the best football player. Nothing is written about them having the cleanest room. What it says is that when security equals the ability to navigate stressful situations and know what to do in response, that quality we've researched and said have found that in adulthood, that quality predicts so much success and so much healthy intimacy and so much happiness later in life. And so really the idea of just doing what's good enough is actually probably going to serve our kids better for the long run. Those children whose needs have not been adequately met for a variety of reasons, I want to just really put a caveat here that insecurity in relationship, we might say it comes because a parent was not good enough or that a parent was bad, but it's really important to understand that the qualities of a good enough caregiver come when we understand the environment that facilitates this to happen. Many children who have medical issues might develop some form of insecurity, not because their parents were bad, but because something happened in the environment which did not promote security. They had to be separated from parents for extended periods of time, for example, or something like that. It can also happen for lots of different reasons that we do not need to say that that parent was a bad parent. So I'm kind of walking away from that idea, but we'll talk about that as we get into good enough. But when a kid's needs have not been met for many different reasons, they begin to see the world as not so safe. They do not mediate stress so well. Instead of sort of sitting up and being able to face the stress of the world and move forward in it, they might shrink away from it. And neurologically, this makes sense because in the brain, without that ability, without those opportunities to turn towards someone and see themselves mediate stress, they would have no pathway in their brain to represent it. And so managing stress is a lot harder. So let's talk just a little bit about those insecure attachments. In attachment science, we've sort of categorized them into 3 different kinds of categories of insecurity. One type of insecure attachment is called avoidant attachment. In this case, something is going on where the parent is not easily accessible, and the child has to adapt by avoiding closeness. So this could be that a parent is overly stressed, perhaps, and is unavailable. It could be that there's medical issues and a parent just isn't available in the room at certain moments of important connection stuff, or many different reasons. But avoidant attachment is where a kid has to sort of withdraw in order to survive and make it. And so that's the avoidant one. We also have a second category called ambivalent, or we might call it anxious attachment. In this, there's some inconsistent interactions in the relationship, and the kid comes to understand that they can't depend on the parent for attunement. This can develop feelings of anxiety or feelings of insecurity. So I want to talk about those 2 for just a minute before we move to the third category. If you've ever seen a kid in a new situation, like for example, if you took a kid to a park and there were a lot of students or kids there that they didn't know, and it was maybe a new situation, there's this really important thing that happens there. So kids, they will go and maybe try to explore this, but what they'll do is they need to turn around and be able to find their caregiver, their safe base. When they do that, when they turn around and find that person, their brain soothes and they're able to go explore a little bit more. When they become stressed again, when a new situation comes, they just turn around and look. Their brain becomes soothed and they go explore some more. And so that process tells them, I can navigate this world. I can figure out this situation. There's my safe base. Go figure it out. In these 2 insecure attachment dynamics, what we would see from an avoidant kiddo would be that in that new situation, they might shut down, never look back for their safe base because there just isn't available. But they might not explore totally, and they might not connect. You'd see sort of a shutdown is what we might call that. In the anxious one, we might see the kid overly clingy to their caregiver, and not able to explore because of that, or only able to explore if the caregiver is right there by their side. So what that would, as you can see, that's the stress response. That's how it translates later into life. So when they, go get into a stressful situation with a spouse, rather than being able to soothe, they might panic, they might get overly anxious in that relationship, or they might avoid the relationship. So that's sort of how that translates later. The third category of insecure attachment is what we call a disorganized attachment. And this kind of insecure attachment, kids are, this is what we might see if kids are abused, or if they saw their parents violent. Basically, if they see that safe base, that person who's supposed to be a safe base, as a source of terror, this really confuses their brain, their system, and they develop what's called a disorganized attachment. One that longs to be close to that caregiver because they're supposed to be their safe base, but also pulls back from their caregiver at the same time. So this is the most extreme kind of insecure attachment, disorganized. Again, this is what is typically found in when there's childhood abuse or witnessing of domestic violence or any of those kind of things. What we know in all insecure attachment is that one of the main issues neurologically going on is that the ability to regulate their internal states is extremely hindered. And research shows that insecure attachments can be related to a lot of the problems we see in childhood. And I have a slide which cites a lot of research that we'll review right here. So what we've found in research is that kids with insecure attachment, we've been able to link things like aggression, noncompliance, and immature behaviors to that. We've also seen that kids with an insecure attachment tend towards generalized anxiety disorders and this overwhelming sense of vulnerability or unsafety. Kids with insecure attachments absolutely struggle more in school, have lower self-esteem, and don't respond well to peer pressure. What we do know is that kids with secure attachment we see them linked to increased attentiveness in schools, ability to participate in school. They tend to get better grades, and they have positive feelings about themselves. So this whole idea of secure attachment and insecure attachment is kind of at the root of so many things. A lot of kids are misdiagnosed or are given a diagnosis that might not fit them very well, when really what's going on is insecure attachment, and the attachment issue can really be looked at there. There's this thing a really important thing to understand about the brain, and that is, I used the term just a second ago, the internal regulation of states. And what I'm talking about is that inside our bodies, inside our brains, we have a stress response system, and it's in all of us. I mean, at any given moment, our brains are always assessing the situation, looking to see if something is safe. And if it ever perceives that something is unsafe, then our bodies and our minds will move into a survival response. So if you look at the slide I've got up right now, this is called the window of tolerance, something we use in trauma work a great deal, but I'm going to use it to describe the beginnings of good enough parenting. So if you look at this little table, there in the middle part, we've got what's called the optimal arousal zone, or what I like to call the sweet zone. The sweet zone is that place where we feel safe, where all is good, and we don't need to be protecting to stay safe. We, from birth, we're designed to be here any moment we're not about to die. So if we're not being chased by a bear or not, about to be attacked by somebody, then we actually should be in our sweet zone. And the sweet zone just means that our brain feels safe and soothed and therefore can access all the available resources in the brain. When learning happens and we are in our sweet zone, then the learning is going to stick and stay really well. When we're in relationships and we're in our sweet zone, really good stuff happens here. Really great, epic spiritual experiences happen in the sweet zone. It's just the place when we feel safe that all of our brain's on board. When we are not safe, when our brain perceives that we are unsafe, it will activate our autonomic nervous system and access the survival response of fight, flight, or freeze. I'm sure you've heard that. The sympathetic nervous system holds our fight or flight response, which takes us up to that top part of the grid there that says high arousal. That's our fight or flight. It's the part of us that says we need to get up and go in order to survive. When we get up there, we shut down certain parts of the brain that are necessary for this sweet zone part, the connecting part, because when we are trying to fight for life, there's no need to take in extra stuff, no need to take in the scenery of the beauty around us. We just need to be surviving. So if I'm getting chased by a bear, the only thing I'm tending to is fighting so that I can survive. When we go there, when any of us go there, we enter into somewhat of a dysregulated state because that threat in that moment is more than what we can handle. In order to regulate after we're in a dysregulated state, we have to be able to soothe ourselves back into our sweet zone. The other side of the fight, flight, or freeze mechanism is the freeze one that we haven't talked about, and that's on the bottom. That's the low arousal. If we're about to die and our system decides that freeze is the best chance of survival, it will go down into there, and it's the same deal. It's a dysregulated state. Now, absolutely, we should be living in those two states if we are actually about to die. And as I mentioned, from birth, that's available to us. What happens in the course of learning and in these attachment relationships is we start wiring down some different meaning to this response. So instead of just going to a fight or flight response only when I'm about to die, like when I'm being chased by a bear, I might learn in my attachment relationships or just in culture that I should go into the fight or flight when I'm stuck in traffic or when money is tight. And so then now it's not just about life or death. I actually move into this fight or flight mechanism for other reasons that I have learned through the course of life. The attachment relationship helps determine what this looks like in all kids. So if you think about my example of a baby crying, when they have no food and their tummies are telling them they're hungry, they will go up to that high arousal state. The parents should come in or want to come in and bring them back down to their sweet zone, to that middle place where they're all integrated. And the course of that happening over time creates this nice little sweet zone right in the middle that is how a kid then figures out how to navigate the world. So if you think about an insecure attachment, their little zone right there in the middle is much smaller than somebody with a secure attachment. That zone means that a certain amount of stress will come in, and they can't tolerate it as much because they don't have this big zone that was created in a secure relationship. And so when they are faced with stress later in life, they won't be able to adjust or move through it quite as well. That's the window of tolerance. The way that a good enough caregiver promotes the creation of a nice, healthy little sweet zone is through these three things right here that I've named. The first is a safe base. The second is through affect regulation. And the third is through relationships. So the first thing that a good enough caregiver provides in order to create security is just a basic safe base, proximity. That when a child through the course of development is having to experience some stress, because that's what growth is stress. When a toddler is taking their first step, they actually have to move towards stress a little bit to do it. And when they are doing that, when they are faced with stress, they are able to come back and find their safe base. When they find their safe base, then that stress moment becomes integrated. And they know then that they can take the next step and the next step. So as a toddler is making their first step, he or she will turn to look for their safe base. And if their safe base is there and says, "Here I am, good job," then suddenly the toddler knows they are okay, and they stand up and they take the next step. Look back at their safe base, make sure they're okay, and they take the next step. And it keeps going like that. So the safe base is the first part of a good enough caregiving relationship, proximity. In adolescence, this might look a little bit different. In adolescent, this might mean that a child could text their mom and know that they would get a response back from their mom. Or it might mean that when they're at a school recital, they look out in the crowd and they see their mom. All of those kind of things soothe the nervous system of kids so that then they can face the challenge that's ahead of them. The second part of good enough caregiving that we're just going to review quickly right here is affect regulation. And that's basically what I've been talking about, of this ability to regulate the states inside of each person. So if you'll, on this little grid, the affect regulation is the ability to experience a peak feeling or a peak, peak stress, and be able to be soothed by it and regulate back. Affect in neuroscience is just the science word for feeling, basically. Affect is our physiological expression or experience of every feeling that comes in. And so this attachment relationship creates pathways or mechanisms from which we then learn to mediate emotions, that when a strong emotion comes in, we are able to move through it and face it just fine and come right out of it. That is affect regulation. When that little zone in the middle that I talked about is smaller, as I said, is true of insecure attachment, the ability to regulate emotions is hindered, is decreased. Affect regulation is created by this very imperfect and messy interaction between kids, where when is necessary, a parent is there to help them regulate, and when it's appropriate, kids are faced with a little bit of stress to figure some stuff out on their own, always knowing that their safe base is right there. So there's like this fine balance in the development of affect regulation of giving just the right amount and then stopping so that kids can be free to explore. This is kind of an important understanding in our culture because we do have a prevalence of sort of helicopter parenting. Which many times, sometimes attachment theory has been used to prove that helicopter theory parenting is good. And I just want to be really clear that at its base, attachment theory would not support that. It would say, in fact, to be good enough, you got to back off quite a bit, but always be present and available, be the safe base, but you got to back off to let kids explore. This is extremely hard in adolescence. This is when I see parents start to redefine their parenting, because kids in adolescence start exploring with things that we think are a bit more risky, and we worry, and it takes a great deal of trust and patience to sort of step back to allow kids to regulate affect and figure some stuff out for themselves. So I like to be really clear that helicopter parenting is not attachment parenting at all. So we got the safe base, most important part of attachment and of good enough parenting. The next, creating space for affect regulation. And then the final part of good enough that kind of creates the science of a secure attachment is relationship. I can't emphasize enough that in this, in good enough parenting, the relationship, the parent-child relationship, is of utmost importance. Now, by relationship, many people, when I start to share this with parents, they say to me, "But I can't be my parent's best friend." Well, that's very true. When I say relationships, I'm not saying this friendship relationship. I'm saying the parent-child relationship is of utmost importance. So if anything is happening that breaks or creates a distance or a wound in the relationship, everything's off the table. The first thing that has to be tended to is relationship. I have a good story of this. some really great parents came in, good enough parents came in to see me for their daughter who's 13 and who was starting to explore sexually. Well, age 13, that's the hard part. All these hormones getting created, sexual stuff is definitely part of it. She'd pushed it beyond what they were comfortable with. So they came in to see me. And these are good enough parents, as I mentioned, and the first thing they said is, we do not know what we're doing. And the truth is, everybody was so discouraged. The girl so discouraged, the parents so discouraged. I think they'd, done everything. The girl's door wasn't on her bedroom. She had no access to anything. She couldn't do anything. She was grounded. I mean, there was just, everybody was, pulling each other's hair out. It was not fun at all. Nobody liked anybody. The daughter was afraid her parents hated her. The parents were afraid she was going to end up, in jail or something, because there was so much fear in not knowing what to do. The very first thing, the most important thing that needed to happen there was to go back to this relationship. Nobody was present for anybody in that relationship because of all the fear, because of not knowing what to do. As soon as we sat down and just got honest with the relationship and just communicated that her parents were there for her, as soon as that was there, they figured out what to do next. But they got lost in what's the perfect parenting response. They thought you needed to take doors off if they were doing certain things, but instead what they needed to do was kind of get down and remember that their relationship was the holding space for this daughter, and it changed the whole story. And I think that's where a lot of the perfect parenting stuff gets lost. We forget about relationship. Another good example is a kiddo who just would not eat what a mom had made for dinner. And it ended up for weeks in this crazy power struggle over food. Nobody was winning this battle at all. Nobody knew what to do. I didn't even know what to do. And so we had to sit down and realize that this power struggle over food was hindering the relationship. And there are just times in good enough parenting where you're just going to have to get it wrong according to standards of our culture and do what feels right for the bigger picture. In this case, the mom just decided this wasn't a battle. She was going to fight, and they created a plan where he gets to make his own sandwiches. It didn't fit. All the people around her said, you shouldn't be a short whatever. She had to throw that idea out, focus on the relationship, and choose a different battle. And that seemed to work really well for her. And I really don't think this kid is going to be screwed up later in life because of it. But we lose so much by thinking things have to be a certain way. So the science of secure attachment comes from a lot of elements, but these three things, the safe base, the affect regulation piece, and then the real emphasis on relationship is that of utmost importance for a good enough caregiver. So I think I'm going to move forward quite a bit here because I notice we've just got about 8 minutes, and I want to move into some practical thoughts and open up for some questions. So please ask some questions as you go. And I want to point out that just an hour is so short for this. Oh, apparently I can make it longer. I can go longer than an hour. Okay. Well, let's just keep going then. I'm going to make it a little bit longer. All right. So let's keep chatting then. We'll move on I'll continue this discussion then of the science of secure attachment. Those three qualities I mentioned earlier, if all else fails, if you're overwhelmed in this discussion right now about what it means to be a good enough caregiver, my advice to you is those three things right there: the safe base, the affect regulation piece, and the relationship. That's it. this idea, this way of parenting is not a to-do list parenting where you have to get it perfect. This is messy business. Like, it's just meant to be. And this to be a good enough parent is sort of a way of being parent. And those three things right there are what I would advise. And if I were sitting down chatting with you, is what we would talk through is those three things: how to be a safe base based on the developmental age of your kiddo, how to effectively support your child in developing affect regulation through your relationship, and 3, how to mediate the messiness so that the relationship is still there, the parent-child relationship. It's the most important relationship ever. But here's some other things I want to add to it that promote the good idea. These are some words from Winnicott himself and some other theorists that said this is the qualities of a good enough caregiver. Attachment safety is of utmost importance. The ability for a kid to turn towards their caregiver and find safety. I think that's pretty understandable. The next one is this thing called attunement. So one way to describe this, I'll start with infancy with this one. Attunement is the ability to feel empathically the emotions of your kiddo and to be attuned to it. So thinking about the example I've been talking about of a infant who's hungry and crying, an attuned caregiver is the one that has spent enough time with this kiddo that knows that this cry means this, or can look at his face and see that he's distressed. That is something super important, and it's innate. So many people hearing this are like, well, that's a no-brainer. Well, that's because it's innate in most of us. I just like to emphasize it because we don't put enough emphasis on the importance of this in our culture. We think this whole feelings thing is not important, but it is. Kids, when we are attuned to our kids' needs, it provides kids with the opportunity to learn that their needs are okay. So when a baby starts to cry and can communicate with us through tone or through facial expression, and we are keyed in enough to know that what they are feeling, then we are able to respond appropriately and give them what they need at that certain point of development. The same is true for the opposite side when not to give them something. So this whole idea of balancing, good and, being there and providing something and not, so that they can figure some stuff out, all has to do with attunement. And we're hardwired to know this. So attunement, the ability to key into our kids' experiences, is super important for good enough parenting. The thing that's important about this too is our lives are so busy that we miss this. So as kids, enter in infancy, it's almost impossible to miss attunement because they need us so much. But as they start to get older and they hit, let's say, age 10, and life is busy and we're heading to dance classes or we're working full-time jobs, the attunement one absolutely gets missed often. And many times in the work I do to support parents, what we have to do is get back to this, which means being present a little bit. Our kids, in order to experience security, need to know that there is a space that they can be seen and heard and felt exactly as they are. And that's attunement is a big part of that. The second part of good enough caregiving is this thing called amplifying mirroring. So our kids' little brains, what they need is to see their experiences mirrored back to them. And when they see that, they know, their brains then integrate it, and they know that this is an okay thing for them to keep about themselves. So, for example, when a kid starts to ride his or her bike and they take their first non-training wheel ride, they'll turn back to their safe base and see, am I okay? And the safe base will mirror back to them their experience. You did it. What that does for the kid is tells them, oh, I did it. It's okay for me to feel proud of myself right now. Awesome. And so then they integrate that little feeling, and not only will they continue doing what they are doing, they're going to keep trying to ride their bike, but also they learn it's okay for me to feel proud of myself. They could only see that, though, when it was mirrored back from us. It's great. Another one is some basic emotions. When a kid is wounded or hurt or feels a sad feeling, when a parent first is attuned to it and understands that that's a sad feeling, and then mirrors it back to them and says something like, "Oh, you're sad," or shows them their sad face, then kids understand, oh, that's what sadness is. So amplifying mirroring is a really important part of a good enough caregiver. In order to do this, the reason this is important is that what we tend to do as parents is we think we have to mirror back to them the right way, the adult way. We need, when our daughter comes home and tells us about the boy they're talking to, I may or may not be speaking from personal experience for my 12-year-old just starting middle school, but they come home and talk about this boy, and all of our fears come up, and we think we have to instruct or teach something, some life skill that they're going to then go and take, and it's going to make them this really great relational being in adulthood. That's actually not how it works. What our kids need is to see their experiences mirrored back from us. So when they are talking about this interaction with this boy, that we are there to help them see what's okay and what isn't okay. This might be a little bit more complicated one to understand right now without some interaction, but please ask any questions if you have any of them. The amplifying mirroring is another really important quality of good enough caregiving, but we got to kind of get out of ourselves enough to let our kids figure some stuff out. Vitalization and soothing is a really important thing of good enough caregiving, and we have actually talked about it a great deal already. It's that affect regulation piece, that when our kids are dysregulated and they need us, that we are there to soothe them. And when they are sort of down on the down end of the continuum, dysregulated, that we help them, vitalize and come up. The ability to help them do that throughout their childhood and adolescence becomes their ability to regulate themselves. The other part that's super important in good enough caregiving is rupture and repair. We do not have to ace this. We are going to get many things wrong, and the rupture and repair is actually an extremely important feature of good enough caregiving. So if we're going to get it wrong, which we're going to, we get to come back and repair it. So if I get frustrated with my child and I create a little wound by yelling at my kid, I don't even have to beat myself up. I can come back and repair that, and that repair mechanism creates even more security. Now, there's a fine line in good enough caregiving. You know how I said 30%, we only have to be good enough 30% of the time. Well, the other 70% of the time can't be traumatic. So when I'm talking about yelling, I'm not talking about trauma and the things that are, really the stuff that puts terror in our kids. That stuff we want to stay away from because it has a profound impact, the trauma part. But the mess up parts where I raise my voice, where I yell and I lash out because I had a bad day at work, or I changed my mind, or all the things. Those things we can embrace and be imperfect, and it provides us this great opportunity to turn around and share that imperfection with our kids. So it could turn around. I'm sorry I yelled. I was frustrated. I had a bad day at work and you didn't deserve any of that. That process is extremely important in creating security. So that's what Winnicott said were the elements of a good enough caregiver. The most important thing to understand when you're a good enough caregiver is that it's messy, that you do not, there just is no such thing as a perfect parent at all. A good enough caregiver recognizes that kids are unique little beings trying to figure out how to be in this world, and that we were gifted with this childhood opportunity to help them figure some stuff out. And I'll tell you, from sitting with kids in a therapy room and raising my own and seeing people, that we're all doing the same thing, and that is making meaning of our lives. Your kids are making meaning of their life separate from you. You are merely the holding space where you provide some authenticity, the relationship, some safety for them to go and figure some stuff out. You do not have to figure it out for them, and they are going to mess up and make mistakes. You are going to mess up and make mistakes, and that's perfect. That is the new perfection. Good enough is the new perfection. And so if I were to say the most important takeaway about being good enough, it would be to get rid of all expectations and then live in the moment in this messy, imperfect emotional interaction with your kids. By doing that, by providing those authentic interactions, you are doing far more for your kids than you would be doing by trying to live up to the standards of these perfect parenting methods that we think we need in our culture. I think I understand why our culture has them. Parenting is important. We must, in our culture, believe that parenting is important. It is. But it isn't, you don't have to be perfect. You just need to be good enough. And so I would just challenge you to leave space to be good enough. Walk away from all these high expectations and just embrace parenting as we're sort of innately built to do it. So I'm going to check in and see if there's any questions or comments that anybody has. Are there? I don't see any. We have some. Okay, so some's going to come in. I'm glad. I'm ready to answer them. Okay. Okay. All right. So it's going to be a second before those questions come in. So I thought what I would do is give some practical resources that I believe support this idea of good enough caregiver. I've given the theory today and sort of a way of being, but I want to recommend a couple books. There's this author, Daniel Siegel is his name, and he recently wrote a book called Drama-Free Discipline. And he is an attachment researcher, so he understands this whole attachment thing. But I think that book is a really great resource that kind of breaks some things down. One of the statements from that book is that's perfect for good enough is that I've posted in my own house. It says, keep calm and connect. So at the end of the day, when we're trying to figure out parenting and we don't know the right thing to do, at a minimum, stop, slow down and connect. Okay, I got some questions here. One question says, how do we do the rupture and repair that have trust issues already caused from adults from their past? Excellent question. I'm so glad that you've asked that. So good enough, the basic of what I've given today, the very basic, assumes that these are kids that are sort of coming in already and we can just give a secure attachment to. What happens when kids come in and they've got some injuries and wounds from the past is that they've got that attachment pathway laid down that has some injuries in it. And so when we start trying to parent in a good enough way, it might not be enough. There might need to be some repairing. And so I always say there's two things that have to happen in these dynamics. The first one is to be a good enough caregiver. And in this kind of dynamic, it's not going to be as easy. You know, if my daughter Ella were to go stay with you and she's got a pretty secure attachment, you would be able to kind of link into that security and do the stuff we talked about here pretty easily. The safe base, she'd be able to look back and find you that thing. But for a kid who's coming in with an attachment pathway with mistrust in there, with injuries, your good enough has to be a little bit different. It's got to accommodate and go in the back door. And so the first step is to be good enough. And the second is to work in some way with acknowledging the wounds and healing them. That whether that's through therapy, which clearly I'm a big proponent through, if you get with the right kind of therapist that understands attachment, these things can be healed and are healed all the time. But the other part is that from an attachment perspective, you, who's as the new good enough caregiver, are enough to help rewire their brain. And this approach is a perfect approach for that. But it means putting in the extra area for repair. When I mention rupture and repair on this, what I mean by that is our own ruptures and repairs. So the repairs from past parents takes a little bit more work. I hope that answers that question. I'm going to ask the next question. How do you try to repair the trust in a child and the adult that are working towards goals together? So I'm going to assume on this question that there's some injuries or something going on that creates mistrust between the child and the caregiver. And I mean, it kind of goes from the same approach. I mean, for one, I'd say what I just said: keep calm and connect, whatever is necessary for connecting. And the next one, the next step I would say in that would be to try all these things that I've mentioned today, the safe base, affect regulation, and relationship. I'd go straight back to safe base. That's the first thing that kids develop. So when mistrust is there and there's some need for repair, the parent is the one with the mature nervous system. So from the mature nervous system perspective, I would encourage the parent to find whatever way he or she can become a safe base for that person. And I know that's such a easy answer. There's probably so many more complexities to be addressed. But please feel free to email me anytime if you have a question about that. The next question... The one question is, can I repeat the book? Yes, it's Daniel Siegel, and the book is No Drama Discipline. Here's another question. Back to the daughter who likes a boy. Instead of instructing, is it good to recount our mixture of joy and anxiety that we felt at the moment and then solicit their feelings about it? Sure. Yeah, on these very specific things, so long as you're doing it, doing everything in a good enough way, it's the right way. This sounds like a great thing. So is it good to recount a mixture of joy and anxiety we felt at that moment and then elicit their feelings about it? Absolutely. The most important, the thing that's good enough about this right here in any response is that you're there. You're the safe base. You're present. And you're available to figure some stuff out. The ability to share your own experience is a very empathic response. I do see some times where kids might feel like they have to change their responses to match their parents. So you have to be careful with that. But if you're attuned to the kid and there's some safety there, that's a great discussion. That's a great way to address that. So I hope that answers that question. I have another question here. I'm a counselor for a domestic violence and sexual assault agency. We see insecure, disorganized attachment frequently. I believe you probably do. I was wondering what you would recommend as most important to teach families. Well, I think the most important thing to teach families is that anything can be healed. I like to start there, first of all, especially if they know that there's some damage and wounds. And we need to be honest and have these kind of conversations with families anyway. We need to be honest when there's wounds there. But that any of this can be healed. The other most important thing that I would want to teach families from this perspective is that I just think that people need to know about attachment. And so I think families need to be taught about secure attachment, about being a good enough caregiver. And we need to take the blocks away that put shame in parenting. We need to make it okay to talk about our mistakes as parents, and that just open the dialogue that way. I hope that answers that question. The insecure, disorganized attachment, especially the disorganized attachment, can be really difficult to understand and navigate, but we know from attachment how to address it. So I think it looks like that might be all the questions. I don't know that for sure. But I appreciate the opportunity to share this, and would love to hear from you. If you have any other questions, you can look me up pretty easily online, Janelle Stauffer. So thank you for your time.
Janelle, we really appreciate you being here this morning. For the information that was fabulous, also for coming out in our kind of wily conditions we had. I think for me, the idea of good enough parenting, we live in a culture where perfection is so important. Yep. And I think that parents often, there is the shame that they're making mistakes. And I think what you have brought to the table is that idea that really mistakes are an opportunity for learning. I mean, that's right. Where the relationships are built. That's where children really learn to navigate in the world. Our generation of helicopter parents that has worked so hard to make everything perfect for our kids creates unmanageable stress for everybody. Yeah. So this idea that good enough is great parenting, it would be really needs to be pushed out there, embraced more. And again, it's kind of goes against what our culture says. So hopefully it will find inroads as we go along. So thank you for sharing that information. Also, to let everybody know, next month, February 2nd, we have Dr. Roger Olson, who is from St. Luke's, and he's going to be presenting on emotional regulation and bonding. So please join us next month, and thank you for being here this morning. Again, all of our webinars are archived on the Idaho Federation YouTube site, so you can go back and look at ones that we have done in the past that have been some really great topics that I know are valuable both to parents that we have in the state of Idaho and also to professionals. So again, thank you, and we will see you next month.
Thank you.
Appreciate it.